Welcome to another video from explainingcomputers.com. This time I'm going to show you how to scratch build a budget desktop PC. I'm going to do this using this Intel Celeron 2.4 GHz dual-core processor and this Gigabyte H61 MAD3V motherboard. These are both very good value components and can together be purchased for about £80 UK, $110 US. Of course, in addition to these, I'm going to need some more components. So for a start, I'm going to need some memory, and this is going to be 8 GB of Corsair DDR3 1333 MHz RAM, which costs about £29 UK, $37 US. I'm going to need a case. Here I'm going to use a CIT Vantage MIDI mesh gaming case, which costs £31, although you do have to add a power supply on top of that, but here I've got a power supply lying around in my bits box. But if you didn't, you can buy a case with a power supply from about £30 UK, about $40 US. We're also going to install some drives, so we're going to need a DVD writer here. Here I'm going to use this LG barebones model that cost me £13.47, and in the US you can buy a similar drive for about $18. Finally, we're going to need a hard disk. Here I'm using an old Raptor drive, again I happen to have lying around, but you can buy yourself a suitable hard drive for about £40 UK, $60 US. For more information on the components I've mentioned, just follow the link in the video description. But now, with everything introduced, I think it's high time we got on with the build. Okay, I thought we'd start out by opening up the motherboard. Here we are. This is a micro ATX board from Gigabyte. Always like Gigabyte boards. That's get in there. That's just to get to the extra pieces. What have we got here? SATA cables for connecting with drives, and I/O screen we'll have fun fitting later on. And here's the board itself. Just let that go down onto the floor there. Open up the anti-static bag and get in there. We can. And if we just slide that out very carefully, I'll stick it down on that board so you can hopefully see that. And this is the board we're going to build our computer from. You can see here very clearly we've got the processor socket, a couple of slots for memory, a slot where we can fit a graphics card, although we won't be doing that. And then down here we have audio jacks, Ethernet connector for connecting network, and 2 USB 2 ports, 2 USB 3 ports, DVI or VGA sockets for connecting a monitor, 2 more USB 2 ports, and a legacy keyboard and mouse port. So, having unboxed the motherboard, I think we should move on and unbox the processor. Okay, this is our Celeron processor, 2.4 GHz dual core. We just take it apart. We need to just cut through the Intel approved seal there. If we open this box up, we can then just slide out the processor and the heatsink. Of course, most of this box is actually the heatsink, not the processor itself. There's the processor on the top. We can get it out. How does these boxes come apart these days? I don't know. Oh yes, it comes. The edges come down, you see. You can put a computer together, but taking an Intel box apart is a much more complicated task. There we are. There is the processor. Quite extraordinary, the size of the things these days. We won't take it out of the package until we need it. But there's the processor we're going to be fitting. And here is the heatsink. This is going to fit on top of the processor, stop it getting too hot. There's a thermal paste, must be sure we don't touch that, so I'll leave that on until we actually need it. Finally, before we start putting things together, let's just take a look at our memory. Again, we need a knife just to get in. So I think we do. There we are. And if we just open that up, won't be very exciting, but we'll just check we have. Oh, they come out in separate things. There they are. There's our Corsair DDR3 memory, all ready to go in. And so I think it's now high time to start actually plugging things together. Right, the first part of the construction is to fit the processor that we have here into the processor socket on the motherboard. To do this, we need to release the lever that holds back the processor retention mechanism like that. And we also need to remove, very carefully, the processor cover from the socket. That's there to protect the pins, just in case we ever need to put it do this again. So make sure you keep that cover, because you may want it if you ever want to change the processor on this board. We then need to take the processor itself, take it out of its little plastic container. I tend to tip them out, because this way you're not risking touching it any more than you have to. We then need to flick the thing over, just touching it very carefully by the edges. Don't want to touch the pins. You mustn't touch the top, because that will stop the thermal compound from the heatsink sticking properly. And you can hopefully see there are two small notches on either side here, and these have to line up with the notches in the processor socket. So if I now very carefully pick this up by those edges, move it along, I can now just drop the processor very gently onto the socket. There's no need for any force at all when you put a processor in these days. It's zero insertion force. We then need to make sure we can take this retention mechanism, slide it back that way, and then push down on the lever underneath, and there we are. The processor is now installed in the computer. The processor does need on top of it a heatsink. The heatsink I showed you, remember earlier, there we are. It's got the thermal paste on the bottom, which will make contact with the processor, melt, and make a very good seal. Now, there's a lot of debate about, do you fit your heatsink when your motherboard's out of the case? Do you fit it when it's in the case? The same with the processor itself. Here I'm using Intel's standard advice, which is to fit your processor when the motherboard is out of the case on its anti-static bag, but to fit your heatsink when the motherboard is secured in the case, and hence I'll do that a little bit later on. However, before we go to look at the case itself, the final thing I can do here is to fit the memory. So I'll open up the clips that will retain the DIMM memory there. I'll take our first stick of memory and install it in the first DIMM socket. There we are. And the clips will come up and secure it at the ends. I'll then take our second stick of memory, another 4 GB going in here. That goes in there, and again the clips will secure it, and there we are. We've now got a motherboard equipped with a processor and memory. Right, next thing we need to do is to start stripping down the case so we can work in it. So if we take off the thumb screws here, 4 of these, let's go 2 at once there. Once we've taken these off, we can take off the side panels. It's always a good idea to take off both the panels, because we're going to have to take them off to mount the drives anyway. You can see on this case we've actually got 2 case fans as well on the side vent, which is very nice. Let's take off the back panel too. There we are. Come on, get off you little... That's very tight. Come on, you want to come off, don't you? There we are. That's it. And we also, as on most cases, we're going to take off eventually the front panel, because if we don't take that off, we'll never get into to fit the drives. So hopefully this will come off. It will. Always looks a bit drastic, doesn't it? But it's perfectly fine, really. You just thread that back through there. And the case is now pretty much slimmed down to a state where we can actually start to work with it. We can just put that down there so we can mount the motherboard. The motherboard will go in here. You might have been wondering what this little orange bag is. Well, that actually contains, I would imagine, I haven't actually checked, but I imagine it will contain, oh look, an exciting instruction sheet, and more importantly, it contains all the little screws and mounting pinions we need to actually make this work. So what we'll do is we'll put that little bag down there as a nice little baggy thing, and we'll now take out all of those screws. You'll see here we have a little sounder. There isn't a speaker in this case, but there is a sounder we can link in. We'll do that later on, of course. get these all out, and here we have all the parts we need to actually fit the thing together. The first thing we need to do, we're down to small parts again, is to fit these motherboard mounting pins. These have to be fitted in the case exactly where the motherboard is going to line up. So I'll do that now. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing here is mounting in these pins, which will in a second support the motherboard. There's quite a few of these to go in, and as you might expect on a cheaper motherboard, maybe the threads aren't perfect, they sometimes need a little bit of help to finish off with Mr. Pliers. Right, it's now time to fit the dreaded I/O shield, the backing plate for the motherboard's connectors. Oh, that was a good start. That just fits in here, hopefully goes in. Go on, you little swine. There we are, that's in there. And needs to be in the back as well, of course, which it's not yet. There we are. That's now properly fitted. Because this case hasn't got a power supply fitted, I'm next going to fit the power supply in, so that what I'm working with is something exactly like what you will have if you're getting a case with a power supply. It just slots in there. Hopefully the screw holes line up, which they do. You can see this is going to be a little swine to fit, but if we line it up like that, we can hopefully take a power supply screw there, the little black ones there, and just fit that in there. Final power supply screw there. And we now have a case ready to accept its motherboard, which has to line up with those little mounting holes, and it also has to line up with all the holes in the back, so it'll come through, and there we are. That worked pretty well. That's a pretty good motherboard first fitting. So all we need to do now is to grab some motherboard screws so we can secure the motherboard nice and firmly into the case. Right, the next job is to fit the heatsink, and this has to line up with these pins lining up with the holes on the motherboard. So we just first of all gently have to get these sitting in place carefully in the right places, which I think they all now are. You then hold the heatsink down and press down alternate corners. So we'll start with that one. That's locked. Keeping the heatsink nice and secure, we'll do the alternate corner. That's locked there. This one will lock here. And finally, we lock over there. So we've now got the heatsink securely locked in place. You might wonder what happened to those pins. They've come through on the other side of the board, and by the magic of filmmaking, here they are. Now it's time to start doing what I sometimes term the knitting. For a start, we need to connect the power for this fan, which is carefully wrapped around there. This small connector has to plug into a socket just down there, and we need to make sure the wire is of course free of the fan itself so that it doesn't get caught up in it. That fan will spin freely. Next we'll think about power connectors. The main power will connect in down here. You might notice if you're eagle-eyed there's 4 pins left on the edge, where many more modern power supplies would have an additional 4 pins for more 12 volt power. You'd need that if you were fitting a very powerful processor on this motherboard, but here my older power supply without that connection will work just fine. But I do have to connect the other 12 volt connector, which goes in down there. I also have to connect up all of these things that link into the case, SD card connector, USB connectors, power switch, reset switch, power LED, etc. You might wonder how I know where these go. Well, there are markings on the motherboard for people with very young eyes, but for everybody else, if you look inside the manual, which you'll find in the motherboard box, I threw it on the floor, but here it is, you'll see there's a key to where everything goes. Because my fingers would get in the way, I'm not going to plug these in on camera, but I'll just show you that I would have to put in the hard drive activity LED, the reset switch wires, the power LED wires, the power switch and the speaker. Also to connect in, we have front USB connectors. Another front USB connector connects to what is the SD card reader on this case, and we also have to connect front audio. Finally, I have to make sure the case fan is connected to a power supply. Often these plug onto the motherboard, but in this case it's a big fan and it connects directly to a standard power connector. Right, with all of that wiring out of the way, it's now time to, I think, upend the case and get on with fitting some drives. So to do that, we will just bend back this plate. I don't know if it'll come out or not. I don't think it has to actually, we can just bend that up. Out of the way now, it's going to get in the way, so we need to somehow remove this metal sheet, which will come off hopefully fairly soon. There we are, that's gone. And we can now insert our LG DVD writer, slowly fitting in there. Just need to line it up with the front hole there and start putting in the first of the screws. One screw there, another at the front, and then two more on the other side. There we are. We then want to slide in our hard disk, goes into there in this bay, and again screw it in. Two screws on this side, and again 2 screws. Also needed on the other side. There we are, the hard disk is now secured in. We then need to connect power to our CD-ROM drive and also a SATA data cable, which will clip in there. Similarly, we need to connect power and also data to our hard drive. Thought I'd use a red wire there so you could see it more easily. Then at the other end, I just need to connect the SATA cable from the hard disk into SATA 0 and the SATA cable from the DVD into SATA 1. I'm now going to deal with the front panel. This panel has a pop-out section, so I need to take out just one of these so DVD-ROM will poke through. I also want to put the wiring through because this front panel has a fan fitted and indeed some LEDs to make it look pretty. So if we put all those through, hopefully, if we line this up with the appropriate holes, the DVD going to come through. It is correctly. Lovely, we got the front panel back on. I'll then bring the wiring through for this fan and lighting and just connect it to another spare power connector. There aren't half a lot of power connectors in this case. That'll never want to fit, do they? But that'll do. And it's just a case now of fitting on the back panel, which hopefully will go back on a little bit easier than it came off. Yes, that's there. And I think we now have a PC that is probably ready to set up with some other components for a first boot. Okay, well here we are at the final hurdle. I've got the PC, I've set it up with a test keyboard and a mouse, obviously a monitor. You can see there's nothing on the monitor screen. I just need to press the magic button. I'll do it in real time so you'll see what's happening. We have fan life. What's happening on the screen? Nothing yet. I can hear hard disk. Oh, we've got BIOS. Fantastic. It works. It works. On the screen, of course, it just says reboot. There's no boot disk. Well, of course, there's nothing on the disk. But all this means the whole thing is working. Marvellous. So there you have it. I've now shown you how to scratch build a desktop PC for about £200 UK, $275 US. Those prices include all of the components with the exception of a monitor. However, on top of all this, you will of course need some software or the computer won't be a great deal of use. In my next video, I'm therefore going to show you how to install a Linux operating system and applications. But now that's it for another video, and I hope to talk to you very, very soon indeed for that Linux installation. Goodbye.